I once bought happiness. Don't let anyone tell you it's not for sale. I bought it every day for 10 years, in cash, with no thought for the consequences. The final bill? $100 million, my reputation, and a decade of my life I can never get back. But the real question isn't if it was worth it. The question is why I kept paying long after I knew I was bankrupt in every way that truly mattered. You know, most stories about wealth start in a dusty garage with a revolutionary idea, or in a cramped office with decades of grinding, thankless work. They are stories about building something from nothing. This isn't one of those stories. This is a story about demolishing an empire that was already built, brick by gilded brick. My story begins not with a spark of genius, but with a phone call. I was 25 years old, bulletproof, or so I thought, and I had just been handed the keys to a kingdom I hadn't earned. My father, Richard, was the architect. A man of quiet discipline and profound foresight, he saw value where others saw dirt lots and dilapidated buildings. For 40 years, he treated money not as a prize, but as a tool. He respected it. He grew it. He built a real estate portfolio so solid, so brilliantly structured, that it was less a business and more a force of nature, a machine that quietly printed money while the world slept. And then he was gone, and the machine was mine. Overnight, I wasn't just Richard's son anymore. I was the man. The world wasn't a place of challenges and opportunities. It was a catalogue, and I had an unlimited line of credit. My father spent his life carefully accumulating. I decided, with the supreme and unquestionable wisdom that only a 25-year-old can possess, that my purpose was to do the exact opposite. My purpose was to spend, and for a while, I was world-class at it. If the thought of a young man with infinite money and zero common sense intrigues you, do yourself a favor, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Let's see how far the legend of my foolishness has traveled. The transition was immediate. One week I was a recent college graduate with a generous allowance. The next, I was sitting in a mahogany-paneled boardroom that felt cold and cavernous. Across the table sat David, my father's right-hand man for 30 years. David had wrinkles deeper than my life experience, and he looked at me with a mixture of pity and terror. He slid a thick binder across the polished table. "Ethan," he began, his voice a low, gravelly hum of prudence. "This is everything. The portfolio, the income streams, the asset valuations. Your father's strategy was always to reinvest 70% of the net income into acquisitions and capital improvements. It's how he built the—" I held up a hand. "David, I appreciate it, I really do, but I'm not my father." He blinked slowly. "I'm aware of that. I don't want to look at spreadsheets," I said, pushing the binder back towards him. "I want to look at the world. Just answer one question for me. After all the bills are paid, the taxes, the management fees, how much can I take out a month without things falling apart?" David took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked down at his papers, then back up at me. It was the look of a master craftsman watching someone take his finest chisel to open a paint can. "Ethan, that's not the right question. The goal is to preserve and grow the principle. Your lifestyle should be a consequence of the portfolio's health, not the other way around." "Humor me," I said, leaning back in the oversized leather chair, feeling powerful for the first time in my life. He did the math in his head. His eyes darted around, as if the numbers were physically painful to him. "Based on current net operating income, you could comfortably draw a significant six-figure sum monthly. But that would halt all growth. It would stagnate the empire your father built." I smiled, a wide, reckless, invincible smile. "Perfect. Stagnation sounds wonderfully relaxing." I stood up, patted him on the shoulder, and walked out of that boardroom, leaving David staring at the binder as if it were a eulogy. In a way, it was. My father treated money like a tool for security. To me, It was rocket fuel, and I had a deep, burning desire to see how high the rocket could go and how spectacular the explosion would be when it inevitably came back down. The first few weeks were a blur of pure, uncut consumption. I walked into a luxury car dealership with the intention of buying a sports car. I couldn't decide between a Ferrari, a Lamborghini, and an Aston Martin. The salesman, a man whose teeth were impossibly white, was trying to explain the subtle differences in performance and handling. I cut him off mid-sentence. "I'll take all three," I said. "The Ferrari in red, the Lamborghini in that obnoxious lime green, and the Aston Martin in classic silver." The look on his face was my first real taste of power. It was intoxicating. Next was the apartment. I didn't want a house in the suburbs. That was my father's world. I wanted to be in the sky. I bought the penthouse of the newest, tallest residential building in the city, a glass box floating above the world. The first person I called wasn't a friend or family member. It was the most expensive interior designer in the country. I met him in the empty, concrete shell of the apartment, the wind whistling through the unfinished window frames. "What's your vision for the space?" he asked, clipboard in hand. "Are we thinking minimalist, industrial, classic, contemporary?" "My vision," I said, gesturing to the panoramic view, "is for every single person who walks in here to feel poor. Your budget is unlimited. Just send the bills to David." That penthouse became my fortress of decadence. David would call me, his voice tight with anxiety. "Ethan, the invoices for the Italian marble are astronomical. And the custom sound system, it costs more than the first building your father ever bought." "Is the check going to bounce, David?" I'd ask, already bored with the conversation. "No, of course not, but—" "Then what's the problem?" I'd say, and hang up. The problem, which I was incapable of understanding, was that I was treating a finite resource as if it were infinite. My father's empire was a vast, deep lake, fed by steady streams of income. I wasn't just drinking from the lake. I was dynamiting it for sport, just to see the splash. It all culminated in the housewarming party, or, as the society pages later called it, the 3-day siege of the skyline. I flew in a Michelin star chef from Paris to handle the food. I had a different world-famous DJ for each night. The champagne wasn't just served. It flowed from a custom-built ice sculpture of my own face. I spent a fortune on appearances by B-list celebrities, just so my guests could take selfies with them. On the third night, standing on my balcony, the city lights glittering below like a carpet of scattered jewels, I felt a sense of absolute mastery. I was 25 years old. I was richer than God. And I was utterly convinced that this was not just a moment, but my new, permanent reality. I raised my glass to the skyline, surrounded by people whose names I didn't know, people who were there for my money, not for me. I felt like a king. I was the master of my universe. What I didn't know was that I wasn't the king. I was the court jester, and the joke was on me. I just hadn't heard the punchline yet. At the zenith of my folly, I believed that my real talent wasn't in having money, but in spending it with a certain theatrical flair. I wasn't just a rich man. I was a curator of impossible experiences, a conductor of a symphony of excess. I thought I was building a legend. In reality, I was just a ghost, haunting a life I hadn't earned, rattling the golden chains my father had left me, mistaking the noise for applause. The first crack in my perfect gilded world didn't appear as a fissure in my finances. It was a subtle, hairline fracture in my soul, a quiet realization that no matter how much I spent, the man in the mirror was still just an empty suit. My penthouse became less a home and more a terminal for my whims. Waking up with a vague craving for authentic croissants was enough to have my private jet fueled and ready before my second cup of coffee. My friends and I would be in Paris by dinner, not for the culture or the art, but for the sheer, arrogant absurdity of it. We would dine at a 3 Michelin-star restaurant, bored by the exquisite food, and fly back the next morning nursing hangovers that cost more than a family car. This wasn't travel. It was a demonstration of dominance over geography and logic. I didn't see the world. I just confirmed it was mine to consume on a whim. This is when my court of jesters began to assemble. At its center was a man named Julian. He wasn't old money or new money. He was a parasite of money, a social chameleon with an uncanny ability to attach himself to wealth. He had perfectly coiffed hair, a wardrobe of bespoke suits, and an opinion on everything from vintage champagne to modern art, none of which he could afford himself. Julian became my chief enabler, my minister of bad ideas. He never saw me as a person. He saw me as a concept, a beautiful, extravagant project to be managed. "Ethan, darling," he'd say, swirling a glass of wine I'd paid for, "collecting cars is so common. You need a legacy. You should be collecting moments, unforgettable, unrepeatable moments." His advice led to a hemorrhage of capital. We chartered the largest yacht in the Mediterranean for a month, not for a specific trip, but simply to have it on standby. We would fly to Monaco on a Tuesday, host a party that would be the talk of the Riviera, and then leave the yacht empty for a week while we pursued some other fleeting fancy in London or Dubai. I bought a racehorse because Julian thought it would be a thrilling diversion. I never saw the horse run. I bought a vineyard in Napa Valley over the phone, without ever setting foot on the property, because Julian declared that a man of my stature should have his own vintage. The wine, when it was finally produced, was mediocre. We used it for cooking. I filled my penthouse with things I didn't understand. I bought a Rothko for a staggering sum, not because the vast expanse of red spoke to me, but because Julian assured me it was the ultimate symbol of intellectual and financial clout. It hung on my wall like a giant silent accusation of my own ignorance. My wine cellar was filled with bottles so rare and valuable that I was too intimidated to open them. They just sat there, gathering dust, monuments to a taste I was merely renting. My life was a meticulously curated performance of wealth. The audience was a rotating cast of models, actors, minor aristocrats, and hangers-on, all brought into my orbit by Julian. They laughed at my jokes, praised my non-existent insights, and marveled at my spending. Their admiration was the currency I craved more than money itself. It was a potent drug, and Julian was my dealer. The voice of reason, in the form of David, had become a distant, nagging hum I did my best to ignore. His emails, filled with warnings and spreadsheets, went unread. His voicemails were deleted without being heard. But one crisp autumn afternoon, he breached my fortress. He showed up at the penthouse unannounced. I was in the middle of a creative meeting with Julian and a team of event planners, storyboarding my 30th birthday party, which was still a few years away. We were debating the logistics of hosting it on a decommissioned aircraft carrier. David walked into the living room, looking utterly out of place in his simple, off-the-rack suit. He was a creature from the real world, and his presence was a jarring intrusion into my fantasy. "We need to talk, Ethan," he said, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the absurd opulence. The half-dozen people being paid to listen to my nonsense. I sighed, annoyed at the interruption. "David, I'm in the middle of something. Can't it wait?" "No," he said, his voice firm. "It can't." He placed a thin folder on the glass coffee table. "Your team and I need the room," he told my entourage. Julian shot me a questioning look. I gave a slight nod, and he gracefully ushered everyone out, promising to continue the naval brainstorming session later. When we were alone, the silence was heavy. David pointed to the folder. "That's the latest financial summary. It's a very simple document. One page shows the income generated by the portfolio your father built. The other page shows your spending for the last 12 months. I didn't look at it. "Get to the point, David." "The point," he said, leaning forward, his voice low and intense, "is that you are setting fire to a forest to toast a marshmallow. You spent more in the last year than the entire portfolio generated in net income. We've been covering the deficit by draining the reserve capital accounts, the same accounts your father set up for emergencies, for market downturns, for once-in-a-generation acquisition opportunities. They're nearly empty, Ethan. So the income is down. The market fluctuates, I said, a pathetic attempt at sounding knowledgeable. The income isn't down, he snapped, a rare flash of anger in his weary eyes. The income is robust, it's healthy, it's a miracle of smart planning. Your spending is the disease, it's a runaway train. If you continue at this pace, the reserves will be gone in 6 months. After that, we'll have to start selling assets, not the small properties, the core assets, the pillars of the empire. I stared at him. He wasn't scolding me, he was pleading, but my ego was a fortress, and his words were bouncing off the walls. I didn't hear concern, I heard criticism. I didn't hear a warning, I heard an insult. He was telling me there was a limit. And in my world, limit was a dirty word. You're just like him, I said, my voice dripping with disdain. My father, always thinking small, always preparing for a rainy day that never comes. You don't understand. The world belongs to the bold. You have to spend money to project power. That's a line from a bad movie, Ethan, David said, standing up. This is reality. You're not projecting power. You're projecting a deeply insecure child playing dress-up in his father's clothes. You are bleeding this company dry. Your father's legacy. That was it. The mention of my father's legacy, held up against my perceived failures, was a lit match to my fuse. Get out, I said quietly. What? I said get out, I repeated, my voice rising. You're fired, David. Your cautious, fearful, small-minded way of thinking is no longer welcome here. Send me your final invoice. He stared at me for a long moment, and his anger dissolved into a profound sadness. He nodded slowly, picked up his folder from the table, and walked towards the door. Before he left, he turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Ethan, he said, his voice barely a whisper, your father was never afraid. He was just smart. There's a difference. Then he was gone. The silence he left behind was deafening. For a single, terrifying moment, the truth of his words pierced my armor. The fear was cold and sharp. I was out of my depth. I was a fraud. But then Julian returned, his smile as bright and hollow as ever. Is the old storm cloud gone? He asked lightly. He saw the look on my face. Don't let him get to you, he purred, placing a hand on my shoulder. Men like that, they don't understand vision. They see a masterpiece and worry about the cost of the paint. His words were the balm my ego desperately needed. He was right. David was the past. I was the future. And I would prove him wrong. I would prove them all wrong. I would show them what being truly bold looked like. Julian, I said, a new, manic energy surging through me. Forget the aircraft carrier. That's thinking too small. My next birthday, I want to rent a private island. I want to fly 100 people to the Caribbean for a week-long party that will make my housewarming look like a quiet dinner. I want to build a legend. Julian's eyes lit up. He saw his next year's income materializing before him. A brilliant, breathtaking idea, Ethan. A true statement. A new financial advisor, a slick yes-man I'd hired to replace David, informed me a week later that the cost of such an event would be astronomical. It was completely impossible to fund with the remaining reserves and income. To pay for the party, he explained, we would have to liquidate a major asset. He suggested selling the Northgate Commercial Tower, one of the first and most consistently profitable buildings my father had ever acquired. It was a pillar of the portfolio, a symbol of his hard-won success. I didn't even hesitate. In my mind, the choice was clear. What was more valuable, a boring tower of steel and glass that sat there silently making money, or an unforgettable epic statement of my own power and freedom? I was choosing my legacy over his. "Sell it," I said, the words coming out with a chilling ease. I felt a surge of defiant exhilaration. I was tearing down a piece of my father's past to build my own spectacular, fleeting present. I was proving that I was not under his shadow. I was proving that I was in control. In reality, I was signing the first page of my own bankruptcy declaration. I had just sold the golden goose to pay for a single, glorious firework. And I stood back, mesmerized by the beautiful colors, completely oblivious to the darkness that was about to follow. The island party was a masterpiece of orchestrated decadence. At least, that's what the articles in the glossy magazines called it. They published photos of beautiful people laughing on white sand beaches, of champagne towers glittering under a tropical moon, of a fireworks display that momentarily outshone the stars. Looking at those pictures now, I feel like I'm viewing a stranger's vacation album. The truth is, the experience itself is a ghost in my memory, a faint, shimmering heat haze. I remember the oppressive logistics, the stress of ensuring every guest's ego was sufficiently stroked, the hollow feeling of standing in the middle of a perfect paradise, feeling absolutely nothing. The money bought the spectacle, but it couldn't purchase a single genuine moment of joy. What I remember with perfect, chilling clarity is the feeling I had when I returned, the feeling of seeing the wire transfer from the sale of the Northgate Tower. The number that appeared in my bank account was obscene. It had so many commas it looked like a line of code. It was a figure that could have funded a small nation for a year. Staring at it on my screen, all the lingering whispers of David's warnings, all the faint pricks of my own conscience, were instantly silenced. The number was my absolution. It was my vindication. In my mind, it wasn't evidence of a catastrophic error. It was proof that I was a man who could solve problems. I had a cash flow issue, and I had liquidated an asset to fix it. It was decisive. It was bold. I felt like a financial titan, not a man-child who had just sold off the family jewels to throw a party. That single transaction taught me the most dangerous lesson of my life, that for every problem there was a simple, brutal, and immediate financial solution. I had just amputated a healthy limb to cure a headache, and I was congratulating myself on my surgical skill. With that mountain of cash at my disposal, the brake lines on my spending weren't just cut. They were vaporized. The relief of being liquid again was so profound that it triggered a new, more frantic level of consumption. I was like a drowning man who'd been thrown a life raft and immediately set it on fire for warmth. My life became a series of grand, pointless gestures. I started a charitable foundation, the Ethan Maxwell Foundation, whose primary mission seemed to be hosting fundraising galas that cost 10 times more to produce than they raised. The events were less about philanthropy and more about providing a stage for me to play the role of the great benefactor, a modern-day Medici. Then came my brief, disastrous career as a film producer. I met a young, ambitious actress at one of my parties and decided, over the course of a single conversation, that I would finance her passion project, a grim, esoteric black-and-white film about the existential angst of a mime. I poured millions into it, building elaborate sets, hiring a respected European director, and flying the entire production to Prague because Julian insisted it had the melancholy light the project required. The film was, of course, an unwatchable mess. It was never released. I had effectively turned millions of dollars into an art house tax write-off, all to impress a woman who disappeared from my life the moment the funding dried up. The money from the Northgate sale, which I had imagined would last for years, vanished in 18 months. One morning, my new financial advisor, a perpetually smiling man named Garrett, whose primary skill was saying absolutely with unnerving enthusiasm, called an urgent meeting. The numbers on his spreadsheet told a familiar story, Only this time, there were no more 9-figure reserve accounts to drain. The income from the remaining properties was a river, but my expenses were a raging ocean. The river was being swallowed whole. "So we're facing a significant liquidity shortfall," Garrett said, his smile never wavering. It was as if he were discussing a minor dip in the stock market, not a 5-alarm financial fire. "So we sell another building," I said, annoyed. "The one on the west side, the industrial lofts." Julian, who was now a permanent fixture in all my financial meetings, chimed in. "Selling is so final, Ethan," he said, examining his manicure. "And messy. Capital gains, taxes, brokerage fees. It's like breaking up a beautiful set. Why demolish the stage when you can just borrow against it?" Garrett nodded eagerly. "Julian is right. The portfolio is massively underleveraged. Your father's strategy was conservative. He abhorred debt. But the modern financial world runs on leverage. It's how smart money works. We can use the properties as collateral to open substantial lines of credit. It's fast, it's clean, and you retain ownership of the assets. You're just unlocking their hidden potential. Unlocking their hidden potential. The phrase was intoxicating. It sounded sophisticated and powerful. My father's philosophy had been to owe no one anything. It was the bedrock of his freedom, but they framed it as a weakness, a relic of a bygone era. They made debt sound not like a trap, but like a tool for the truly powerful. They weren't suggesting I go into debt to survive. They were suggesting I embrace it as a strategy to live on a grander scale. It was the answer I desperately wanted to hear. The first loan was against a block of retail properties. The bank was ecstatic to have my business. The paperwork was signed, and another colossal sum of money appeared in my account. It was easier than selling, faster. There was no sense of loss, only gain. It felt like I had discovered a magic trick. My father had shown me how to make money the slow way. I had found a way to conjure it out of thin air. This is when I met Chloe. She wasn't like the other women who drifted in and out of my circle. She had a sharp, acquisitive intelligence and an ambition that rivaled my own. She was a supernova of glamour and desire, and I was instantly drawn to her gravitational pull. Our courtship was a transactional ballet. I would shower her with gifts, a closet full of designer clothes, a new convertible, a trip to Milan for Fashion Week, and she in turn would adorn my life, making my extravagant existence feel validated, even purposeful. She was the perfect accessory for the man I was pretending to be. She didn't just love the lifestyle, she embodied it, and her desires became a new, endless frontier for my spending. With Chloe by my side, the borrowing escalated. We took out a second mortgage, then a third. Each time, the justification was a new necessity. A summer home in the Hamptons, a complete redecoration of the penthouse, because Chloe found the old design oppressively masculine, and then, the ultimate symbol of my delusion, a private jet. Garrett rationalized it as a necessary business expense, though the only business it ever conducted was flying us to a private resort in the Maldives. Each loan was another shovelful of earth removed from the foundation of my father's empire. From the outside, the structure looked as magnificent as ever, but underneath I was hollowing it out, leaving a fragile, brittle shell. I was no longer just living off the fruits of my father's labor. I was now actively betting his entire life's work against my ability to continue this insane charade. The interest payments alone began to grow into a monstrous figure, a beast that needed to be fed every single month, demanding more and more of the portfolio's core income. The breaking point, the moment where I consciously chose oblivion over reality, happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was with Chloe at a famously exclusive jewelry boutique on Fifth Avenue. She had fallen in love with a necklace. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a cascade of flawless, impossibly large diamonds, a constellation of condensed light that glittered with a cold, cruel fire. The price was breathtaking, a figure that would have been a rounding error a few years ago, but now represented a genuine crisis. As I stood there, mesmerized by the way the diamonds captured the light, my phone buzzed. It was my private banker, a man whose voice had grown increasingly strained over the past few months. I stepped away. "Ethan," he said, dispensing with the usual pleasantries, "we have a problem. You've hit the ceiling on your consolidated line of credit. In fact, you've exceeded it. I can't authorize any more significant withdrawals until we restructure the debt, which will require a fresh appraisal of your assets and a serious conversation about your spending." His words were clear. The magic trick was over. The well was dry. I was standing at a crossroads. Behind me was the wreckage of my inheritance. Ahead of me was a cliff. And right in front of me, Chloe was holding the diamond necklace against her throat, looking at her reflection with pure, unadulterated longing. I looked at her, then back at the sterile, unforgiving architecture of the bank on the other side of the street. I could hear the banker still talking on the phone, his words turning into meaningless static. He was speaking the language of consequences, of limits, of a world I had refused to inhabit. Chloe was speaking a different language, the language of desire, of appearance, of the beautiful, unsustainable now. I made my choice. "Do whatever you have to do," I told the banker, my voice cold and steady. "Restructure it, appraise it, just make it work." I hung up before he could reply. I walked back over to Chloe, took the necklace from her, and handed the velvet box to the jeweler. "We'll take it," I said. At that moment, paying for the diamonds felt more important than preserving the last remnants of my father's legacy. I was no longer just spending the money from my past. I was actively and with full knowledge stealing from my own future. And as I watched them wrap the box in silk ribbon, I felt a terrifying, exhilarating rush. It was the thrill of a man who has decided to jump just to see what the fall feels like. Denial is not a passive state. It's an active, exhausting, full-time job. It's the art of building a fortress of lies around yourself, and then working tirelessly day and night to patch the cracks as they appear. For a while, my fortress was impenetrable. I lived inside a bubble of curated reality, surrounded by the shimmering mirage of my own infallibility. But reality is patient. It doesn't argue or shout. It just sends out tremors, small seismic warnings that vibrate through the foundations of your delusions. At first, they are easy to ignore, like the distant rumble of a coming storm. But then they grow stronger, more frequent, until the very ground beneath your feet begins to feel unstable, and you realize you're not in a fortress at all. You're in a house of cards, and a hurricane is on its way. The first tremor was subtle, almost comical. We were at a restaurant, one of those places where the tasting menu costs more than the monthly rent on a normal person's apartment. It was the finale of an extravagant meal designed to celebrate a non-existent occasion. I presented my black card, the mythical piece of anodized titanium that had been my Excalibur for years, my proof of belonging to the global elite. The waiter, a young man with a professionally neutral expression, returned a few minutes later and leaned in, whispering so quietly I could barely hear him over the clinking of glasses. "I'm terribly sorry, sir, but the card has been declined." I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. It was a sensation so foreign I didn't immediately recognize it. Julian, ever the smooth operator, handled it with a dismissive wave, paying the bill with his own card, knowing he would be reimbursed at 1,000% interest in favors. But the moment lingered. It was a tiny glitch in the matrix of my perfect life, a brief, horrifying glimpse behind the curtain. Garrett, my yes-man advisor, assured me it was a technical error, a security flag from the bank due to the unusual spending patterns. I chose to believe him because the alternative was unthinkable. Soon, these glitches became a recurring theme. A check I wrote for a substantial 5-figure sum at a charity auction bounced. The polite, then insistent, then threatening calls from the auction's organizers became a source of constant low-grade anxiety. I started screening my calls, letting everything go to voicemail, creating a buffer between me and the encroaching reality. The jet, my ultimate symbol of freedom, became a gilded cage. I owed months of fees for its maintenance, fuel, and the pilot's salaries. On more than one occasion, a planned impromptu trip to St. Bart's had to be postponed due to unscheduled mechanical issues, a lie I concocted to hide the fact that the management company had grounded the plane until my arrears were paid. My social circle, once a vast and bustling ecosystem, began to contract. The invitations to exclusive events, which had once flooded my mailbox, slowed to a trickle. I was becoming yesterday's news, a spectacle whose novelty was wearing off. More tellingly, the people I had surrounded myself with, the ones who had fed off my largesse, began to sense the shift in the financial weather. Julian, my high priest of profligacy, started becoming conspicuously busy, always engaged in some urgent new venture whenever I suggested a new, wildly expensive undertaking. He was a rat, and he was the first to feel the vibrations of a sinking ship. Chloe, however, remained. Her response to our dwindling resources was not to curb her spending, but to intensify it, as if she could somehow reverse our fortunes through sheer, defiant consumption. Our arguments became a staple of our life together. They were quiet, vicious battles fought in whispers amidst the opulence of our penthouse. "The boutique on Madison called," she'd say, her voice as sharp and cold as an icicle. "They said my account is on hold." It was embarrassing. "There's just a temporary cash flow situation," I'd reply, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Garrett is restructuring some things. It will be sorted out." "It's always being sorted out, Ethan," she'd shoot back, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't the life you promised me. You promised me the world. Right now I can't even buy a pair of shoes." To placate her, to quiet my own roaring fear, I would resort to increasingly desperate measures. I was no longer just borrowing against the properties. That well had run dry. The banks, once so eager for my business, now saw me as a liability. Their doors were closed, so I descended into the financial underworld. I started dealing with private lenders, shadowy figures who operated out of nondescript offices and charged interest rates that were nothing short of predatory. They were vultures, and they could smell death. These were not loans based on my assets' value. They were fire sales of my future. I signed away equity stakes in my father's buildings for a fraction of their worth, just to get my hands on quick, liquid cash. Each transaction was a fresh stab wound to my father's legacy, a desperate act of self-mutilation to get a temporary fix. I would get a wire transfer for a few $100,000, enough to calm Chloe, pay off the most aggressive creditors, and maintain the illusion of solvency for another month. The relief was immediate, but it was followed by a crushing, sickening dread. I knew I was only accelerating the inevitable. I was selling the floorboards of my house to pay for the heating bill. My world shrank to the 4 walls of my penthouse. I stopped going out. I was terrified of public humiliation, of another declined card, of running into someone I owed money to. I lived in a state of perpetual twilight, curtains drawn, phone silenced, hiding from the world I had once so desperately tried to impress. The parties stopped. The laughter died. The silence in that vast, empty apartment was broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and the venom of my arguments with Chloe. I became a ghost in my own life, haunted by the spectre of my own impending ruin. I would spend hours staring at my father's portrait, which hung in my study. His expression was one of calm, steady intelligence, and it felt like a constant, silent judgment. I had taken his life's work, a testament to discipline, patience, and wisdom, and I had used it as kindling for a bonfire of my own ego. The end, when it began, did not arrive with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, formal letter. It was delivered by courier, on thick, expensive paper embossed with the letterhead of the primary financial institution that held the mortgages on the bulk of my remaining properties. It wasn't a warning, it wasn't a threat. It was a formal notice of default. I read the jargon-filled paragraphs, my hands trembling. Phrases like breach of covenant, loan-to-value ratio, and immediate acceleration of all outstanding obligations swam before my eyes. The gist was simple and brutal. A slight downturn in the commercial real estate market, the very kind of rainy day my father had always prepared for and I had always mocked, had caused the appraised value of my properties to dip. This dip had triggered a clause in my loan agreements. My debt now exceeded a contractually agreed-upon percentage of my assets' value. The bank was no longer secure. The letter stated that I had 30 days to remedy the situation by injecting a substantial amount of capital, a figure so large it was laughable, to rebalance the ratio. If I failed to do so, they would exercise their legal right to seize the collateral, which was, of course, everything. I sat there in my silent, darkened study, the letter lying on the desk in front of me. It felt less like a piece of paper and more like a tombstone. For 10 years, I had been running from reality. I had outspent it, outborrowed it, and outbluffed it. But now it had finally caught up. It had cornered me in this room, and there was nowhere left to run. My phone rang. It was my banker, the same man whose advice I had so arrogantly dismissed in the jewelry store. I knew he was calling to deliver the verbal coup de grâce. I stared at the phone as it buzzed on the polished wood of the desk, its insistent vibration a final tremor before the earthquake. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of my entire world about to collapse, and in that moment I realized the most terrifying thing of all. I hadn't just lost my father's fortune. I had lost myself somewhere along the way, and I had no idea who the man was who was about to pick up the phone and face the end. Before I narrate the final, breathtaking implosion of my paper empire, if you've followed me this far down the rabbit hole and still haven't subscribed, now is the time. Hit that button. And tell me in the comments, what do you think was my most foolish purchase? The private island party, the vanity film project, or that cursed diamond necklace? I'm curious to know which monument to my stupidity stands tallest in your eyes. The descent was nothing like I had imagined. In my darkest, most anxious moments, I had pictured a slow, agonizing decline, a protracted series of painful losses. The reality was infinitely more brutal. It wasn't a decline. It was a detonation. It was a single, blinding flash, followed by a deafening shockwave that obliterated everything I had ever known. The 10 years I had spent meticulously constructing my life of fantasy were undone in less than a month. After the banker's phone call, a conversation I barely remember, filled with cold clinical terms like liquidation, receivership, and legal proceedings, I entered a state of profound shock. I was a passenger in a car careening towards a cliff, and my hands were no longer on the wheel. The 30-day grace period mentioned in the letter was a legal fiction. The moment I was in default, a cascade of cross-collateralization clauses was triggered across all my various loans. The private lenders, the vultures I had made deals with in back alleys, were the first to strike. They didn't have the patience of the banks. They moved with the speed of predators. The first tangible sign was the disappearance of my cars. I woke one morning to the sound of hydraulic lifts and shouting from the street below. I looked out the window of my penthouse and saw my holy trinity, the Ferrari, the Lamborghini, the Aston Martin, being unceremoniously loaded onto flatbed trucks. It was a public spectacle, a piece of street theatre for the amusement of dog walkers and early morning commuters. I didn't even have the keys anymore. The lenders had already claimed ownership. Then came the men in suits. They weren't the deferential, smiling bankers of my past. These were insolvency practitioners, corporate undertakers with cold eyes and zero empathy. They moved through my penthouse with clipboards, cataloguing every single item of value. The Rothko on the wall, the collection of rare watches in my safe, the custom-made furniture. Everything was tagged with a small, numbered sticker. They were inventorying my life for auction. I was a pharaoh whose tomb was being plundered before he was even dead. Chloe watched this invasion with a kind of horrified disbelief that quickly curdled into pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't rage at me for my foolishness or my lies. She raged at the universe for the sheer injustice of it all. She saw herself as the primary victim. "They can't do this," she seethed, watching a man carefully place her designer handbags into a labeled box. "This is mine. You gave it to me." "It was never really mine to give," I mumbled, the truth of that statement hitting me with the force of a physical blow. Our final conversation was not a dramatic, tear-filled confrontation. It was a quiet, surgical severing. She packed a single large suitcase with the things they hadn't yet tagged, the clothes she was wearing, a few pieces of jewelry she managed to conceal, including, I noted with a detached sense of irony, the infamous diamond necklace. "I'm going to my mother's," she announced, not looking at me. "For how long?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She finally turned to face me, and her expression was one I had never seen before. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was a complete and utter void. It was the look you give a stranger who has bumped into you on the street. I no longer existed for her. "Don't call me Ethan," she said. And then she walked out of the penthouse, out of the life we had built, her heels clicking on the Italian marble with a sound of chilling finality. I never saw her again. Her departure was a strange kind of relief. The performance was finally over. I no longer had to pretend. The days that followed were a surreal blur. The phones were cut off. The electricity went next. I lived in my glass palace in the sky like a modern-day hermit, watching the sunset paint the city in hues of gold and orange, colors I was too numb to appreciate. The city that had once been my playground now felt like an alien landscape. The climax arrived in the form of an eviction notice taped to my front door. The bank had foreclosed on the penthouse. I had 72 hours to vacate the premises. The sheer humiliation of it was staggering. Ethan Maxwell, the man who had once rented a private island, was being evicted. The process of leaving was a study in shame. I had to pack my own life into cardboard boxes, sifting through the wreckage of my former existence. What do you take with you when you've lost everything? The designer clothes felt like a costume from a play that had closed. The expensive gadgets were useless without power. I found myself packing the small, insignificant things. A handful of old photographs of me and my father, a dog-eared book he had once given me, the simple, inexpensive watch I had been wearing the day I inherited his fortune. These were the only things that felt real. The final day was grey and rainy. A security guard and a representative from the bank, a young woman who couldn't bring herself to make eye contact with me, stood by the door as I carried my few boxes out. I took one last look at the apartment. Stripped of its custom furniture and expensive art, it was just a cold, empty space. A mausoleum for a life that had never really been lived. As I rode the elevator down for the last time, I caught my reflection in the polished bronze doors. I saw a man I barely recognized. He was 35 years old, but he looked 50. His eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a sweater that felt alien on his skin. This was the man beneath the billion-dollar facade. A stranger. Stepping out onto the street was like stepping into another dimension. The doorman, who had greeted me by name with a fawning smile 1,000 times, now stared straight through me as if I were invisible. I had no car, no driver. I stood on the wet pavement, a handful of boxes at my feet, the rain soaking through my clothes. I had no idea where to go. My so-called friends, Julian and the rest of the pack, had vanished as if they had never existed. I was utterly, completely alone. The nadir, the absolute bottom, came a week later. I was in bankruptcy court. It wasn't a grand wood-paneled courtroom from a movie. It was a sterile, fluorescent-lit room in a drab government building filled with the quiet desperation of people at the end of their rope. When my name was called, I stood before a trustee, a weary-looking woman who had seen it all before. She read from a list, her voice a monotone drone, reciting the litany of my failures. The list of creditors was pages long, a who's who of every luxury brand, five-star hotel, and high-end service provider in the world. The total sum of my debts was a number that sounded like a statistical error. After the hearing, as I was leaving the courthouse, I saw him. David, my father's old advisor. He was standing across the street, holding an umbrella, just watching me. He looked older, grayer, but his eyes were the same, filled with that familiar, sad wisdom. Our eyes met for a brief moment across the bustling street. I expected to see triumph, a look that said, "I told you so." But there was none. There was only a profound, heartbreaking pity. I ducked my head in shame and hurried away, disappearing into the anonymous crowd. That night I found myself in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place with peeling wallpaper and a lingering smell of disinfectant. The room was paid for with the last few $100 of cash I had in my pocket. I lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling. The noise of the traffic outside was a relentless roar. 10 years ago, I had inherited a kingdom. Now, I didn't even own the pillow under my head. It was in that moment, in the suffocating silence of that run-down motel room, that the full, crushing weight of my reality finally landed on me. I hadn't just lost the money. I had squandered a legacy. I had desecrated my father's memory. I had erased 4 decades of his hard work in a single decade of my own selfish folly. And for what? For the fleeting admiration of people I despised. For a collection of moments I couldn't even remember? I began to weep. Not for the lost jets or the vanished penthouses, but for the man I could have been, the son my father deserved. The tears weren't just for my loss, they were for my profound and unforgivable wastefulness. I had been given everything, and I had turned it all into nothing. The fall was complete. I was at ground zero. You would think that hitting rock bottom is the end of the story. It feels like it. The impact shatters everything you thought you were, leaving behind a smoking crater where your life used to be. But the strange, paradoxical truth is that the bottom is the only place you can begin to build a foundation that won't crumble. For years, I had lived in the sky, in a glass tower built on a fantasy of wealth. The fall was horrific, but it brought me back down to earth. And it was only there, with my feet finally planted on solid, unforgiving ground, that I could begin to learn how to stand on my own. The first few years after the bankruptcy were a crucible. Humiliation was my constant companion. I, Ethan Maxwell, the man whose name had once been a fixture in society columns, was now invisible. I took whatever work I could find. I was a prep cook in a diner, my hands, once accustomed to the feel of a steering wheel of a supercar, now raw from peeling potatoes and scrubbing greasy pans. I worked the graveyard shift at a warehouse, loading trucks, my body aching with a physical exhaustion I had never known. I sold cheap suits at a discount menswear store, forcing a smile as I measured the inseams of men who had more dignity in their calloused hands than I had possessed in my entire pampered life. Every day was a fresh lesson in humility. I saw my face once on the cover of a tabloid magazine at a newsstand, a grainy, unflattering photo under the headline, "How the Mighty Have Fallen from Penthouse to Pauper." I felt a familiar surge of shame, but then something else, something new, a strange sense of detachment. The man in that photo, with his arrogant smirk and hollow eyes, was a character I had once played. He wasn't me. Not anymore. The loneliness was profound. The world I had inhabited had been crowded but empty. Now, my world was just empty. The phone never rang. No emails arrived. The silence was absolute. But in that silence, I began to hear my own thoughts for the first time. Stripped of the noise of parties, the flattery of sycophants, and the constant nagging pressure to maintain the illusion, I was forced to confront the stranger I had become. The turning point didn't come in a sudden cinematic epiphany. It was a slow, quiet dawn. It began with the simple act of earning my first paycheck. It was a pathetic amount, barely enough to cover the rent on my tiny, windowless room in a boarding house. But as I held that slip of paper in my hand, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in over a decade. Pride. I had earned this. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a loan. It wasn't a magic trick. It was the result of my own labor. It was real. That small flicker grew. I started to find a quiet satisfaction in simple things. The taste of a hot coffee on a cold morning before work, the pleasure of reading a book from the public library, the feeling of being so tired from a day of honest work that sleep came instantly, without the aid of alcohol or anxiety. I was learning the value of $1, not as a unit of consumption, but as a unit of effort. I discovered that a meal you can barely afford but have earned yourself tastes infinitely better than a feast you never deserved. One day, summoning a courage I didn't know I possessed, I found David. He had long since retired. I found his address and went to his small, modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I stood on his doorstep for a long time before I could bring myself to ring the bell. When he opened the door, his expression wasn't one of anger or surprise. It was one of quiet expectation, as if he had been waiting for me. We sat in his backyard, surrounded by the beautiful garden he tended with his own hands. I didn't make excuses. I didn't try to explain my actions. I just apologized. I apologized for my arrogance, for my disrespect, for throwing away everything he and my father had worked so hard to build and protect. He listened patiently, and when I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your father never cared about the money, Ethan," he finally said, his voice soft. "Not really. He saw it as a byproduct of doing good work, of creating value, of building something that would last. The buildings, the portfolio, that was just the scoreboard. The game was about discipline, integrity, and honor. That was the real inheritance he wanted to leave you. You didn't know how to accept it." His words didn't absolve me, but they gave me a new perspective. I hadn't just lost a fortune, I had misunderstood the entire concept of what it meant to be wealthy. My father's wealth wasn't in his bank accounts, it was in his character, and that was a fortune that couldn't be spent, only earned. That conversation was the beginning of my true reconstruction, not a financial one. That ship had sailed, and I had no desire to build another one. It was a reconstruction of the man. I went back to school at night, taking community college classes in business management and accounting, the very subjects I had scorned in my youth. I wanted to understand the machine my father had built, not to replicate it, but to respect it. Today, my life is small, and it is my own. I'm 60 years old. I work as a consultant for a small property management firm, helping young entrepreneurs avoid the same catastrophic mistakes I made. My advice is simple: live below your means, abhor debt, and understand that the true measure of your worth is not what you have, but what you can live without. I don't own a house or a fancy car. I live in a simple apartment. My net worth is probably less than what I used to spend on a single weekend, but I'm richer than I have ever been. I've learned that money is an amplifier. It doesn't corrupt you, it just makes you a more concentrated version of who you already are. If you are insecure, it will make you arrogant. If you are empty, it will make you decadent. If you are kind, it will make you generous. The $100 million fortune I inherited didn't destroy me. It merely exposed the profound poverty that was already inside me. I lost an empire trying to buy happiness, only to discover that authentic joy is not for sale. It's in the quiet pride of a day's work well done. It's in the genuine connection with another person. It's in the peace of mind that comes from knowing who you are when all the external validation has been stripped away. I wouldn't wish my fall on my worst enemy. But I wouldn't trade the lessons I learned from it for all the money in the world. I lost the world my father gave me, and in doing so, I finally, painstakingly, built one of my own. My story is a cautionary tale, a map of a shipwreck. If it resonated with you, share this video with someone who might need to hear this message. And finally, leave your own wisdom in the comments below. What is the greatest lesson that life or money has ever taught you? Let's learn from each other. Thank you for listening.